Melissa,
Sarah.
what are we reading today?
We're reading Piglet by Lottie Hazell.
Delicious.
Sarah, we finally made it through January. Oh my gosh, the longest month of life. I feel like every time I just looked at the calendar, it was just January upon January upon January. It's been a bit of a slog, but not all bad. January is the month of your birth and lovely snow days and lots of things are enjoyable in January. How was your January?
Sure, January is wonderful.
All because of your birthday.
No, I mean, anyone who knows me at all knows how much I lament having a birthday in January because it is the longest, darkest, coldest month of the year if you're living in the northern hemisphere. And yeah, I always am so envious of those who have summer birthdays and they get to just bask in the sunshine and warmth for their birthday. And mine is on January 21st, so it is like among the darkest and coldest. Actually, here in Connecticut, it was like the coldest day of the year. So that's great. So yeah, it is. There's like so many memes that are always popping into my feeds about, it's been a long year. Oh, it's only January 15th. So that is for sure. But yes, I did have a birthday, and connected to this podcast, I ended up getting a couple books, which was nice. So that was certainly a perk. And if there's anything that's good about January and the fact that there's not a ton that you can do outside of maybe some like winter sports, is that it's a perfect time to read a book or multiple books. So can't complain
Yes.
about it.
I had a secret message from your husband around the date of your birthday. And of course he was like, I need to get Sarah some books for her birthday. What should I get her? And initially I was like, oh, I'll just kind of go through and make a list of like books that I think you would like. But then it occurred to me that as part of your 2025 reading goals, you've been really active on Goodreads. So I just went into Goodreads and literally just looked at your books you wanted to read list that you had made and placed there. It's like the very, if you ever go into a shared Amazon account that you have with your spouse and just fill up the cart and they're like, what should I get you for Valentine's Day? It's like, honey, just hit buy everything in the cart. I've got this totally taken care of for you. So I was like delighted that I was able to kind of help him create that list. And how did I do? Were you pleased with the ones that he got for you?
I was pleased. And so one of them I actually ended up reading right away. I've already finished it. It was a short book. So it was Rental House by Wiki Wang.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Um, and that one was like, I think like 270 pager. Um, and I enjoyed it. So that was a good choice. And the other one is Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner. And that one I have not, I technically, as of Goodreads, I did say that I began it, but then I decided that because, I did a decent amount of reading in January. I read 5 books in the
Whew.
month of January. And so I was going to be like, maybe we'll go for 6 before the end of the month and it'll be this book. But that one is a bit of a longer book. And that one I think is supposed to be like more of like kind of like a thriller-esque, like kind of like environmental espionage, something along those lines. So it's very different than some of the other books that I read during the month of January. And so I was like, you know what? I think I'm gonna just like take a little breather and then jump right back in early February and knock some more books out. So you did a great job, Melissa, and it
Excellent.
definitely helped me with my reading my reading goals for January and
Yeah.
to kick the year off.
Well, luckily, like
So
we said, since there's 8 weeks in the month of January, you can get more reading done, and you don't want to be outdoors, so it all works out. But For anyone who didn't catch our first episode of the year, which was an audio-only episode available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and our YouTube channel, of course, we did talk a lot about our reading goals, but we also talked about all fours, which was read. We both read it. It was part of a reading challenge that Sarah set out for me on our very first ever Rogers episode last summer. So we talked about that, but we also talked about all the goals that we wanted to have throughout this year, which included, Violet, sorry. Sarah had said, obviously Violet is my daughter's name, and I love you both so dearly that your names just interchange
Unlike your
in
daughter.
my brain and mouth. Yeah. But that you were hoping to do better tracking and keep a better reading flow. And it sounds like you very confidently said, I'm going to take a little break from reading. I'm not going to fuss my way through a book if I don't need to right now. So is that kind of how you felt about this little pause with is it Rachel Kushner book?
Yes. Yeah. I think, like you said, flow was important to me. And so I think it's good to kind of have like a little bit of, an ebb and flow, right? And so this is the ebb in my flow. And I think that's good because, one of the things that we talked about during that particular episode was this idea of like, you don't want to be so kind of competitive with yourself, with your own reading, that you're just like reading for the sake of reading just to get through it and not to really just be able to immerse yourself and enjoy it. And so with that book, because it is so different than the 5 other books that I had read, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to take a little pause and then I'm going to get right back into it. And so I feel good about it. So the flow is a flowing, even when it's ebbing. But Melissa, so we had different types of goals. And so for you, I feel like yours was all about strategy and organization. And really kind of, making sure that you were really thinking ahead of time about what you're going to read, planning it out, keeping to a budget. So how are you doing as we enter a new month?
I'm doing good. I'm feeling good about it. So my goal this year was to try to read on a budget because as much as I love supporting authors, I love supporting publishers and booksellers. My book addiction was starting to get a little bit more costly than I was comfortable with. So I thought to myself, no, there are other methods of getting books, whether it's from loaning them to people, using the library, and so on. And to date, according to my budget spreadsheet, which I keep pretty up to date, I am still in the black between books that I've borrowed from friends, a book that I got as a gift, and then a book that I had purchased in 2024. So it's a little bit of a gray area, but it's no money spent in 2025, I'll say that much. So I have managed to stay on track and on budget. And actually the book that I'm going to talk about today, Piglet, I got from my local library and I had to order it in. So this was something I was talking to you about how I was going to have to be more organized and order them in and maybe wait for the hold to be filled. And I did have it was a bit of excitement, checking and refreshing my library account, and then what excitement indeed when it was ready for pickup and I could go to the library and get it. So I'm really into that experience so far. I did get a little bit impatient while I was waiting and actually went, yeah, big surprise there. So I decided to sort of trick the system. I would go into a common bookstore's website and I downloaded the free sample of the book so that I could read the first portion of it to sort of tide me over before I actually could get the physical book from the library. So I was also a little bit excited that I came up with that little hack to get me through so that I didn't have to wait, because like I told you, I love having something in the hopper that I'm going to read right away. But as much fun as it was to have something ordered and come in for me and all that, I think the next book I get from the library, I'm going to go in and peruse the stacks, because there's something I'm kind of craving about that feeling of being at the library and something just kind of speaking to me, and then I get to take it home and dive in. So that's going to be my approach for the next book. But now that I've got this one finished up.
Excellent. Well, I love it. And creative as always, you've got to be strategic and you've got to be creative sometimes. And so,
Problem
yeah, when you
solving.
have to wait, a little bit, then what are you going to do to tide yourself over? And I think it worked well. But I would love to kind of be brought into this world of this book, Piglet, that you got from your local library. So, would you be able to give a bit of like a summary on it?
Absolutely. So, Piglet by Lottie Hazell follows the story of a woman called Piglet. And I have to say, I knew I was entering into a book that was going to include a main character who went by this name. And I had kind of thought I would become desensitized to like such a kind of frankly grotesque naming of someone. I thought it would just eventually be something that I didn't notice anymore. This was not the case. It was very, very clear to me. I kind of winced, to be honest, a lot of the times I would see this person being referred to by this name or like the short form of just simply Pig. It was definitely a big part of my reading experience, the repetition of that name for the person. And we'll get into talking about the name in more detail, but Piglet is the main character in this book, and when we meet her, she and her fiance Kit have just bought a brand new house. It's a very sort of lavish, fancy house, and frankly, Kit's a pretty lavish and fancy guy. So he comes from a really high-class background, she's from sort of a more working-class background, and they're about to get married. So we see them in these early stages of the book, and we're thinking, wow, things are really looking great, at least from the exterior, for Kit and Piglet. 13 days before they're set to get married, Kit reveals to Piglet that he has been deceitful in some way. Now, we're never told exactly what Kit does, but we know that he has deceived her or he's been deceptive in some way. And I think that's kind of indicative of Hazel's approach to character development, and she's been very upfront about this in interviews that she wants them to be kind of sparse, that she wants us to know them enough to be interested in them and to kind of follow their journey, but also to be able to kind of put ourselves in their place. So the rest of the book and the bulk of the book is sort of Piglet coping with the sort of emotional turmoil of being delivered this news about Kit's situation with her, and deciding how she's going to handle their wedding day and then, the days that ensue.
Wow, that's quite a book. But I do want to get back to this naming business because, yeah, I could totally understand that a name like Piglet and abbreviated to Pig would, yeah, almost give you like you said, like a visceral reaction every single time you're reading it on the page. And I would imagine that from the author's, that perspective, I mean, obviously, if she's like making characters and certain plots a little bit sparse, that this was a very pointed decision in naming this character Piglet. So, um, what do you think it means for her to have been named this way? And let's get into that a little bit more.
Yeah, and yeah, I love what you're saying there too about just like how heavily coded the name is, given that everything else is a bit sparse. So it's kind of heavy-handed there when everything else is a little bit kind of looser. Yeah, I mean, right away, she's referred to as Piglet. So it's not like there's any sort of build up to it. They're referring to her in this way, just the same as if she had a typical name a la Anne or Mary sort of thing. Like it's just very regularly used. But pretty early on in the book, I think it's within the first 10 pages. I know this because it was part of the free sample that I downloaded before I got the book physically from the library. There's a part where someone says to her about, so you just go by this name, like, and not your given name. And she says, yeah, like I pretty much exclusively go by this name, to the point that when someone calls me my actual name, I feel like I'm in trouble. I feel like someone's getting mad at me. And she says, you've got my parents to thank for that. And then she kind of changes the subject. It's clear she doesn't really want to talk about her relationship with her parents and how that name, came to be. And the way I really took that was this idea of how people can sort of assign people what they might consider as a harmless nickname, just something that they might see as playful, but that long term it has massive effects on people. And I think it kind of influences a lot of how people see themselves in the world and also how they sort of calculate their own self-worth. So that it came from what might have just been thought of as playful from her parents' perspectives, but it stuck and then it really informed who she became. And then later in the book, the sort of second direct reference to the nickname itself and how it came to be is in a scene before the wedding when her parents come to visit. And they're kind of reflecting, I think this is pretty common around the time people get married, that the parents are really reflecting on when she was a child and telling lots of stories about when she was little. And they tell a story of when Piglet ended up, I think, overeating and overindulging, and then they assign this name to her. But then through the narrator, we get sort of that same story and that same scenario the way that Piglet remembers it, which is very different, obviously. And the way that she remembers it is much more in relation to her sister, and that her sister had essentially an eating disorder that was kind of like, her parents were not tuned into it at all. And Piglet was really concerned about it. And so some of her overindulgences and her overeating was done in a way that she was trying to protect her sister, trying to help her sister. It's kind of complicated to get into without revealing too much about the book, but ultimately that those were sort of the sources of the book itself, of the name itself, sorry. But I really feel like the author kind of applied this name to her so that we could kind of understand that this was the family environment that she came from, and we could find some meaning there, but also to kind of help us understand how she must have understood herself when this is what she was being called.
And how do you think that Piglet sees herself, and how does the author show how this nickname impacted that sense of self and maybe self-worth?
There's so many times throughout the book when she describes her physical self in relation to the people who are around her. So she'll talk about like standing near someone at work and feeling like she's towering over them. Or at one point she gives her sister a hug and she says she kind of engulfs her. So just these feelings of like her way of understanding her body in relation to the bodies of the people around her. And I don't think I speak, as in isolation here. I think most women can relate to this, but I know I really connected to that part in the sense of how I've felt at different times in my life looking at photographs of myself, especially as a younger person. So I don't think I struggle with this quite as much as an adult, but as a younger person, finding a photograph of myself, I know that I was always trying to make sure that I was positioned in a certain way, or that I was appearing in a certain way in relation to the other people in the photo. And not that long ago, somebody posted a picture from high school on social media. So when you get tagged on a photo and it's like someone you haven't talked to in like 15
Yeah.
years, and you're either like, they're gonna try to sell me a subscription to something here, or it's gonna be some grainy photo from 2001. So that's what it was. And even seeing that photo, like I was immediately brought back to that experience of when I would have seen that photo for the first time as a teenager. And just seeing it as an adult and knowing what my concerns were, looking at it as a young person, but then as an adult looking at it and just seeing a group of friends having fun. And I just felt like almost sad for myself that was how I had seen that photo and seen myself, 20 years ago as compared to now. So I think like that part of it in terms of this character being very frequently referred to as Piglet, like I think the repetition of the name is significant. But then also the fact that the author creates this rift in her relationship with Kit that she needs to evaluate how she's going to respond to his actions, to his admission. And she does not immediately dump him. And even he feels he should be immediately dumped. And she only reveals to one other person in the story what he's done. And that person immediately says to her, you should not accept this from him. You should not accept this type of treatment. But I think what we're trying to be shown here is that she doesn't believe that she is necessarily worthy of more, right? If she's always understood herself as lesser than, because she has been addressed by a name like this, then she, of course, would accept lesser than in terms of the partner that she chooses as her husband. So I feel like that's how this idea of self-worth really gets shown in the book, because of how she determines her self-worth based on the people around her and how she must be seen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do think that there is something both universal, I feel like for women in particular, because the way that we are valued based on and judged based on our bodies and the space that we take up, both the space that we take up physically, but also the space that we take up even like emotionally or
Mm.
mentally. And so I can definitely, I can definitely understand, that feeling. And yeah, and I think that that also makes sense that, she would maybe be more forgiving, or if not forgiving, then accepting of
Hmm.
certain, behaviors, because she feels that, well, you know, I'm lucky to have what I have, or it's okay that I get less than what maybe others get.
And
That's
I think in their relationship in particular, there's so much at play as well in terms of class, right? That he's coming from this upper class background, she's coming from this working class background. And I think exactly what you're saying, this notion that this should be good enough. Like, why are you expecting any more than this? Both from, like, maybe her relationship, but also from just where this marriage will put her socially. She will effectively be kind of set for life in terms of her finances by entering into this marriage. So she's giving up a lot by walking away from it if she chooses to walk away from it. So that evaluation of value and worth, I think it extends beyond just her, what she feels she's worthy of, but also to, like, how she, to what degree she should be accepting of things in order to have stability in her life.
right. Yeah. Now, you did mention that this is all leading up to a wedding, her wedding with Kit. And I feel like weddings can be so interesting, like an interesting event to shape a narrative around, or to have as featured a part of a story, because there's so much that kind of comes together at a wedding, right? You're not only like kind of bringing in two families together. Many times I feel like in stories, you're looking at like opposite ends of the spectrum from one, kind of to the other. And I just feel like they're just tinder boxes just waiting to explode, because I mean, you think about planning your own wedding and it's one of the most stressful times of your life in a certain way, because you've got this one event, this one, teeny day really in the scope of your lifetime, but like you're putting so much emphasis
Mm.
on it, and so many things can go wrong, and you have this idea of perfection. And so I just feel like a wedding as an event, or as something happening in a book, can be really interesting. So how did the author use weddings in this book, and how effective do you think it was?
Oh yeah, like very effective. I think just from the sheer layout of the book itself is in relation to the wedding. So the first portion of the book is divided into segments, not in like sort of numbered chapters, but rather in how many days until the wedding. So the first
Hmm.
sort of chapter is like 98 days, then 21 days, 13 days, and so on until you get to the date of the wedding. And then the final part is actually divided into 4 sections, which are old, new, borrowed, and blue, which is, of course,
Ah,
the famous sort of like, I don't know what it is, a tradition or adage around marriages and sort of bringing in all these items that fit into those 4 categories. And I feel like one thing about weddings, too, is that they're really useful settings in books because pretty much all of us have some experience with them, whether it's standing in a wedding or being a bride or even just having attended a wedding. And so I think people are familiar with a lot of the traditions, so you can really kind of immerse yourself in those scenes a lot as well. So I was really like interested in how she presented it, not only as a concept and sort of building up that timeline and so on, but also as the event itself. And look, you and I both, we both did the big wedding thing. And as much as, I had a blast at both of our weddings, at your wedding and at mine. But,
yeah,
looking back, would I have done things differently? Yeah, probably. It
totally.
is such a sort of strangely indulgent thing. And, one thing I feel like, and I'd like to share a passage in a second too, but there's like the documenting of the wedding, which is crazy when we got married, but I think now it's even worse with like more active social media and that sort of thing, and sort of real time, documenting or publication of weddings happening. But there's like, these moments, and it's totally a thing about weddings where the photographer follows you around everywhere, including into your own bedroom, like photographs of you getting dressed, a total stranger on like the most important day of your life, a very intimate moment, like so much stress and emotion. And a total stranger is taking photos of you in your underwear getting dressed. And this is totally a thing, like very, very bizarre. So I feel like the author did such a great job of showing how weddings are like overly lavish, overly showy, overly phony in some ways, and also kind of invasive, especially when it comes to the bride. So of course the class piece is there, but what I'd love to read in this particular passage, I think, is just this really nice culmination sort of through the lens of the wedding of all of these themes in the book about overconsumption, greed, overindulgence, but also that idea of self-worth and understanding ourselves and our bodies in relation to other people and how damaging that can be. So I will read this part, and it needs just a smidgen of setting up here. So bear with me. It's going to be in the part of the book where she's getting on her wedding dress. So we need to rewind back a little bit and keep in mind that when she went for her final fitting, the clerk at the bridal store advised her that she should go on a fast, which, let's face it, she was telling her to starve herself. But then at the same time, we know that Piglet is going through an awful lot, not to mention just planning a wedding on its own is incredibly stressful. These merging of families and this sort of all the stress of event planning as your side hustle while you also get on with your life. But she's also going through all that stress of planning a wedding to a man who has admittedly deceived her in some way. So she's under a tremendous amount of stress, and she does seek comfort in food. So she does not fast, obviously, and rather she tends to kind of, I'm hesitant to use the word binge, but I think that is the appropriate word, that she does kind of binge eat in this case, and it does result in changes to her body. So where we're going to be in this passage is in her room. When you hear the name Madeline, that's just the photographer, just the total stranger in the room, photographing her getting dressed for her wedding day. The book is set in England, so when I do reference pounds, it's actually the currency, not a reference to weight.
Okay.
And so we're in the bedroom. The mother and the sister have attempted to get her dressed, and they're struggling with, it's a bit snug. They're trying to get the dress on, so they decide to bring the father in. And it's a bit of a kind of emotional in a way moment, because he is expecting the big reveal of his daughter in her wedding gown, and he has purchased the dress. And so he comes in with his eyes covered, and he's going, oh, it's the big reveal. But they kind of have to tamper him and say, like, no, we need your help with something. So here I go. Piglet could see his expression in the mirror, smile fading, the shape of it staying on his face, now filled with disappointment. What's happened here, Pig? His father said, lifting his head in the mirror, not meeting her eyes. Piglet thought she could feel Madeline flinch. Her mother placed a hand on his, looking up into his face. In the mirror, Piglet watched her, nodding at him, her fingers clasped tight. We just need your help to close the buttons, an extra pair of hands. What's the problem? Her father leaned forward, her mother's carefully placed hand slipping away from him. He inspected his daughter's back. She imagined it there, half-dressed, spilling out over the wedding gown like overproved dough, and wondered what it would be like to knock herself back, fold her flesh over, and tuck herself in. Oh, Pig, he said, what have you done? She did not know how to answer, but he did not need her input. He continued, this is 3,000 pounds of dress, Duck. Not now, her mother said. She knows, if you could just pull the corset together. So her father was there too, with her mother and sister at her back, trying to hold her together. She could smell him now, male, shower gel fresh, a whiff of black coffee on his breath. Pig, breathe in, he said. She did as she was asked, but only seemed to swell in size. She heard the lace strain. Stop, stop, stop. She stopped. Her inflated body slumped. Pull your shoulders back, her mother said, and she did, arching her back, contorting her body, making herself as small as possible. Around her, she felt her family force her body into a dress too tight, the button hook at her back, the metal implement connecting the four of them, their energy moving between them as if it were electricity. In the ensuite mirror opposite, she could only see their bent backs, their bodies shuffling to accommodate her. Just a few more, Piglet felt her father's hand push against her flank, his knuckles hard and swollen with effort, and she thought she heard a huff of laughter or some pressure, some worry releasing. Don't move, her mother said, tapping her fingers lightly on her shoulder. We're nearly there. She puffed and Piglet turned to look, tempted by the sight of her smiling parents. No! She felt the popping release of a button, buttons coming undone. Did you not hear your mother? She said don't move. Her father had shouted. In the mirror, she could see a vein popping in his forehead. And she saw his frustration with her. She saw his disgust. You couldn't have just waited, could you? He said, closing his eyes. You couldn't just control yourself for once. He shook his head. You, this dress, greed, he said, his words failing him in his displeasure. She wondered as he spluttered whether his anger had been prompted by the gown's price or her overspilling body.
Ooh.
And one thing, just reading it out loud too, like, didn't it feel like I said the word piglet and pig like 1,000 times? Like, couldn't you just feel the pain of that naming even in that short passage?
Yeah, and it's such a I mean, there's so much description, like even like the closeness, how she can smell the shower gel and the coffee on his breath and the vein popping in his forehead, and like this idea of like the mirror and her being able to see what's going on behind her and to feel everything, like so much detail. It's harrowing. And
Mm-hmm.
like, and then you add in this use of the name pig
Mm-hmm.
in that context, and it's, oh, like,
And
oh,
I think like
brutal.
the wedding, like it's clothing, right? And so you have this, you can sort of step away and just be like, oh, they're just talking about sort of how we do have to often shape ourselves. I mean, think of all of the restricting clothing that we've worn over the years. Girdles and corsets and all these things to sort of manipulate how we look and how we look in relation to other people and how we present to the world. But in this case, it's her wedding dress too, right? And it's this idea of she's being forced into this dress, she's being forced into all these sort of circumstances and this marriage, and just this idea of contortion that she doesn't really feel comfortable, right? There's no comfort in her life, that she's sort of seeking to feel herself, and she's trying to find that. And I have to be cautious here because I'm not particularly sympathetic to the father, right? Like that scene, I have no sympathy for what he says to her, how he addresses her, and clearly how he's related to her and her relationship to food as a young woman and, you know, coming up through life. And their relationship is obviously strained. But one of the readings I had of this scene, just to kind of try to wrap my head around him, right? Because it's worthwhile, whatever character is there, whether you like them or not, you do kind of have to try to get into their head and understand their role and their perspective and their position. But I think that there's something happening there in terms of the societal pressures that are on him as well. So we're leading up to this wedding. There's a lot of sort of expectations around what the contributions of the father of the bride will be. And she's marrying into this sort of upper crust kind of family, and he's not able to meet those expectations. And so there is discussion in the book leading up to this point that ultimately Kit's family kind of bear the brunt of the cost of the wedding. But he goes out of his way to say, well, I'm going to get her dress. Like that, clearly it's important to him, whether it's tradition or some kind of, you know, maybe reserved way of showing his love for her as her father, that he's going to provide the dress for her. And it does end up being more expensive than he's ready to pay, but he does pay for it. And then here he is standing in this moment trying to get her into this dress, and it doesn't fit. And that he just feels like maybe there are some gaps in terms of what the societal pressures are on him and then what he's able to deliver as well. So again, I'm not particularly sympathetic to him in this moment, but I did have that reading of him just to sort of see that maybe he was floundering a bit himself, if I can kind of be a bit generous there.
Yeah, and yeah, I could imagine that he, in his mind, is thinking like, I did my part. I did what I could do, and maybe it was even more than what I could do. Like, did he go into debt to buy this dress? You know what I
Right.
mean? And like, and this idea of the expectation of like, all you had to do was fit into it.
Right.
Like, but then there's also this idea, I mean, I feel like the, the symbolism of like, you know, like you said, like contorting yourself to fit into something where you don't belong or trying to
Mm.
fit into somewhere where it doesn't quite feel right. And how that it's not just about a physical size or experience, but it's about that societal one about
Hmm.
like what do you have to do to get yourself to blend in or to feel like you can be a part of something.
Mm.
And and I feel like she's obviously feeling that, and I would imagine that the family is feeling that too. Like we're doing everything we can do to feel like we can actually be a part of this day and fit in to something that where we don't normally where we
Hmm.
wouldn't belong, or we're not being made to feel like we belong. And I'm sure even just the judgment of you know, well, the groom's family had to foot the bill. That's not usually how it goes,
Yeah.
but I guess in this circumstance, so
Yeah,
just all of the pressure from everybody.
there's a lot of discussion around the cars. So, like when they're
Mm.
pulling up to the venue or they're at an event before, like a wedding affiliated, being able to very clearly know who was driving which vehicle, right? Because there was such a marked difference. And yeah, I think like Piglet also puts so much pressure on herself. So she decides at some point that she is going to make sure that she's the one who makes her wedding cake. And not just any wedding cake. She's going to make 3 croquembouche the day of her wedding, which also creates a very like
That
dramatic
sounds terrible.
scene. Yeah, I know, it did. And they end up like glue gunning some of the cream puffs on. And like it's kind of comical. Like again, like weddings do kind of lend themselves nicely to these sort of dramatic ensemble kind of pieces, where everyone's kind of running around chaotically because everything's supposed to be so scheduled and everything. But she sets really high expectations for herself, which I also think is related to this notion of self-worth, that she's like, okay, if I'm going to be accepted into this family, like, well, aren't I lucky that they're willing to allow me into this family? I really need to go above and beyond. So not only is she self-conscious about how she looks, but also her family and how they're going to be perceived, that she also kind of gives herself all these extra jobs and everything to try to create this croquembouche. And just to go back to that point, how he says to her, all you had to do, was fit into this dress. And it just broke my heart because I thought, yeah, all you had to do was that. But meanwhile, we're all calling you this grotesque name that we've called you forever. You're under a tremendous amount of stress and you don't feel you're worthy of anyone's support, because she does confide in one person. It's actually her maid of honor about whatever it is that Kit has done. And that person kind of doesn't really support her, and then she doesn't feel like she can go to her family with it. She doesn't really have a larger circle of friends. So she does feel really isolated and really alienated from a lot of people, which I just think like there's so much that she's bearing on her shoulders alone, then to add in sort of these extra pressures is so much. It's probably worth pointing out that the maid of honor, who, and I totally disagree with this move, regardless of whatever happened, whatever she didn't think that Kit should or shouldn't have done, she decides that she's not going to be part of the wedding. So she sort of withdraws from her role of maid
Ooh.
of honor and sort of leaves Piglet solo on her wedding day, which I think I have issues with that. But anyway, throughout most of the book, that friend is pregnant. She does end up having the child. And there's another woman who's pregnant in the book. And I find I've been really kind of trying to piece those together because, for one, at one point, Piglet is very stressed out. She's in a really awkward situation, which she removes herself from, and she ends up going to a restaurant. She orders a very large portion, and people come and find her, and the reaction, at least as she presents them to us as the reader, are sort of people reacting in sort of, disgust, I don't want to use that word, but they're sort of turned off by her doing this. But then similarly, one of the pregnant characters does pretty much the exact same thing, and everybody's like, that's so cute. She had a craving, and even though the behaviors are the same, that they're received so differently. So I can't quite articulate, how that was all expressed in the book, but I really felt the contrast of like Piglet was not allowed to do things that this pregnant woman was doing, all because of that. But then, these pregnant women are doing this amazing thing with their body, and I couldn't help but think about my own experiences through pregnancy and my own experiences, in terms of my body image and how I felt about myself throughout my younger life. And I had kind of prepared myself before I had kids to think like, okay, well, I'm probably not going to really like the way I look after I have kids, or I'm not going to really feel confident in my body after I have kids. And I was just kind of ready for that. In fact, it was the exact opposite. Like having a child, growing a child, nourishing a child, like that was the most confident I ever felt about my body. It completely changed the way I understood myself as a woman. I understood myself as a person. I understood sort of this physical vessel in which I reside. So I really am trying to kind of wrap my head around these two pregnant characters alongside Piglet in this book. And I think it's probably just an indication of like she did layer on so many themes that it's hard to kind of sift through them and figure out exactly how they all interplay.
Yeah. I keep thinking of the word excuse, and I
Mm.
don't, and I'm just encountering all of this for the first time. So I'm also kind of trying to wrap my mind around it all. But like this idea of that, like some people have an excuse for certain behaviors. Like when you're
Mm.
pregnant, like, yeah, you can eat what, I mean, not whatever, but like you can eat larger
Not
quantities
sushi.
or
No.
yeah, not sushi, not like sandwich meat. Um, but there's also something to that as well. This idea of like what you can and cannot do, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what excuse do you have that people will accept to be able to have certain behaviors, but wouldn't be accepted from somebody else. That I don't know, like there might be there's something there,
There's
and
something
certainly
there.
something, yeah,
Yeah, I
to
guess, and I think, we talk a lot about double standards for men and women too, and those always are, really useful tools in books too. And, I think there's sort of an implication that the father has a lot more sympathy for Kit because she doesn't tell him exactly what Kit did, but she tries to express to her father the night before the wedding, this is not, I know this all looks great on the outside, but this isn't what it looks like. And I'm struggling for other reasons because it finds her, she's crying in the kitchen. And he really tries to kind of patch it up. And shortly after the passage that I read, he says to her, you can't get enough. Like you're just always after something more, something more. And he says, you are supposed to try to make this work with him, and without even knowing anything about what the situation is. So I do think there's like sort of that double standard there of like, he must have had an excuse, like you said, for whatever it is he did. I don't even want to hear about it. It's your job now as his partner to make that okay. So I think it is, yeah, we're circling it. We're circling it, Sarah. We're getting
yeah,
there.
it's there somewhere. I did read a review of this book, and they, interestingly enough, and I know that you watched at least one season of the show. I don't know if you ended up watching both seasons, but, and they were actually, this is going back to the idea of the name Piglet for the character, the idea of the show Fleabag, and, you know, the identity of, someone associating and kind of like embodying their name. And so I found that interesting, and I just want to like, do you see any connection between the two types of characters, or
That is
like
so funny. When you were
yeah.
setting that up, and when you said I think you watched one season, I totally thought you were going to talk about White Lotus, because
Oh,
these two characters, and I'm blanking on their names in the first season of White Lotus, and he was remember
oh
he was Pete from The Office.
yeah,
I can't remember the characters, but
I
there's a
can't think of their names, but I know exactly who you're talking
yeah,
about
there's a
in
young
in
couple on
yeah.
this White Lotus show, and she marries into she's sort of a working class background. He's very upper crust. The mother, played by Molly Shannon, like shows up on their honeymoon. It's like so similar, actually. Like she could have used, one could be used as like a sort of influence for the other, for sure. As for Fleabag, the difference there, I think, is that even throughout the first season, if I recall correctly, nobody actually calls her Fleabag. She's only referred to as Fleabag in the descriptions outside of like the fourth wall
But
or
they don't
whatever.
have a name for her, right?
No, but she's not. I guess just the
But nobody's
difference
like, "Hey,
being,
Fleabag, hey,
yeah,
Flea," and as opposed to Piglet
Piglet Pig.
and Pig. Yeah.
Yeah, but I could
And
see
what's
some
interesting
parallels
is
there.
I didn't think about the fact that until you were really describing it, when you first said, like, she's referred to as Piglet, I thought like the narrator refers to her as Piglet. That's the name that she has for herself in her head. And that maybe she's not referred to at all, like by an
Mm,
actual name. But the fact that her name is actually, like, not name, but her nickname that people refer to her as is actually Piglet and Pig. Like that just puts like a whole other spin on it.
yeah.
Um,
There's one part when things really escalate on the wedding day when she starts
mm,
to be referred to as Mrs. Edwards. And so, she's kind of playing with that identity thing there as well. But that only lasts about 2 pages. And there's literally one instance when there's about 10 pages left to the book when Kit addresses her as a different name. And it's never clearly stated, like, oh, he called me by my first name. It's like, the way that the conversation goes, he's addressing her and he's using a different name. They're the only two people in the room. And you go, oh, so that's her name. Like
it's
that's,
her actual
and
name.
it's noticeable, but not necessarily meaningful because I think it's been overshadowed by just however many hundreds of pages of her being called that way. So yeah,
Yeah, that it's probably maybe even like an empty gesture, right? Like you
or
may
even,
use
yeah, that's
her
so
actual
true.
name, her given name, but that it doesn't really ultimately mean anything.
Yeah. Or it feels very formal. Because especially in the early part of the book, how she says, when people use my full name, I feel like they're mad at me. And
Oh,
so to know that when they're trying to have this conversation, maybe reach some sort of a common ground, that's when he chooses to use her name, and knowing that her reaction to that would be, oh, he's angry at me. I think, again, coming back to this idea of self-worth and double standard, it's like
mm,
he's the one in the wrong. He said he was in the wrong, but yet in this moment, the author makes it clear to us that her reaction was probably still going to be, oh, I'm the one in trouble, not him. Yeah.
yeah. There's a lot to this book, Melissa. Which can be a really great thing, right? Because a book that makes us think and a book that, really kind of puts some maybe puzzles in front of us of what we think things mean or why we think things were placed in our characters or, episodes were featured. But I feel like I do want to ask the question, Melissa. In your opinion, is Piglet by Lottie Hazell a could read, a should read, or a must read?
So if you had asked me this question the minute I closed it and put it down, I think I would have teetered in a different direction. I think this is a book that could very easily be read sort of just a straight through superficial read. But it wasn't until I actually started to reflect a lot more on it, in preparation for this conversation, obviously, but that it was sort of percolating, and then I was reading some articles and listening to some interviews, that I really started to see more and more like how many layers of things that she did manage to pull together, some of which I'm still trying to figure out, as made evident in our earlier discussion. So for those reasons, I am giving Piglet by Lottie Hazell a should read. I think this is a very good book that could appeal to a very broad audience of people. I think that pretty much anyone could read through it and find portions that they really connect to, that really speak to them in certain ways. And I'm really, really glad that I read it. I'm glad that the Newfoundland and Labrador Public Library System had it available for me to request, for it to come in and to be able to enjoy this book free of charge. So I would encourage others to pick it up and do the same. I definitely recommend this book, and I'm calling it a should read.
I feel like a should read from you, Melissa, is praise for sure, because I don't think you give out should reads and certainly not must reads super easily. So
No,
I'm happy.
when I was thinking about it, I thought, like, if I'm being fully honest, even our discussion right now has like nudged me a little closer to like just so much closer to a must read, even though I'm not quite there. But I think the distinction for me is like, I feel like the must reads really have to punch me in the gut. Like they really have to get me in the feels in some way, or really just kind of mess with my brain a bit, to really like bring me into that sort of stratosphere of must read. But just the more and more that I think about this book, the higher it does climb. But I do think that, you know, it's not quite in that must read territory, but definitely a solid read.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, I feel like should um, get you thinking so that
Mm-hmm.
it's not just like a surface read and it's not like a disposable read where you've read it and you're not gonna think about it again. A should read is something where, you are, kind of asking more questions after you've finished reading, or it might speak to something that you've, experienced yourself when you were younger or in your life, or encountered somebody in that you can recognize like elements of them in,
Mm.
in the book, and that it can maybe show a new perspective to you. And so
Yeah,
it
for
sounds
sure.
pretty solid to me, Melissa, and
Yeah,
I'm really happy to have talked to you about it, and heard about it. And maybe I'll just give Piglet a try at some point this year.
I would love that.
Add it to my list.
Add it to the
So,
Goodreads platform.
and so great that, like you said, you were able to access it through your local library, and keep on your tight budget for
I'll just
2025.
splurge on something crazy at the end of the year. No.
Yeah, maybe you and I can see each other and
Oh,
splurge together.
dream.
Always a dream, right?
Thank you so much for this. Always love our chats, my friend.
Me
And happy
too.
belated birthday.
Thank you so much, and happy end of January.
Woohoo, we made it.
I know.
See you.
All right. Bye.